Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, soyez les bienvenus ici chez Carleton University. Welcome to Carleton University. Happy International Women's Day. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at Carleton, and I have the real privilege to be the project director of something called LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. And I say that not only out of protocol. I say that for very substantive reasons, for us to be mindful of not only the teachings of elders past and present and the knowledge that has been shared on this space, but also to be mindful of the fact that the themes of dislocation and dispossession that we discuss in other parts of the world today in the context of refugee and forced migration studies is a dynamic and a phenomenon that the consequences of which continue to play out in this space as well. It is, as I say, a privilege to be able to welcome our colleagues, our friends, and our partners from Journalists for Human Rights to join us today on this panel to launch the report on the Journalism for Human Rights Gender Report, putting women and girls in the headline. We're very fortunate to have Journalists for Human Rights as an NGO partner in something called LERRN, this Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. This is a 7-year partnership that's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And it's a very innovative project which tries to achieve what we hope is a fairly simple but yet ambitious goal, and that is to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in outcomes in pursuing protection and solutions with and for refugees, and determining outcomes in the global refugee regime. It's a partnership between 4 Canadian universities, not only Carleton, but the University of Ottawa, York University, and McGill. Our NGO partners, not only Journalists for Human Rights, but also Oxfam and CARE, and national working groups in Kenya, Tanzania, Lebanon, and Jordan. And our working group partners in each country are led by a national academic. In the case of Tanzania, Professor Koti Kamanga at the University of Dar es Salaam, but working in partnership with national NGO, national civil society, and refugee-led organizations to be able to identify the priorities and the opportunities to which the partnership can respond through research, through training, and through knowledge mobilization and knowledge sharing. What we're trying to do is reverse the trend where 85% of the world's refugees today are hosted in low and middle income countries in the global south, but much more than 85% of the knowledge, more than 85% of commentary on refugee issues originates from the global north. So it's trying to be able to highlight and amplify and support the perspectives of those actors, those researchers, those commentators who are closest to the phenomenon in which we're trying to collectively engage. So we're very privileged to be working with our NGO partners, but also with our advisory committee, which includes Global Affairs Canada, which includes the International Development Research Centre, which includes the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, but also includes a group called the Network for Refugee Voices, an organization that is trying to coordinate the contribution of more than 450 refugee-led organizations from around the world to be involved in the making and implementation of global refugee policy. This notion of partnership, of collaboration, of participation is something that's important to all of our partners. As we'll hear today, this is at the heart of the work of Journalists for Human Rights, but also of our partners Oxfam and our partners CARE, who through their work have been highlighting the importance of engaging with and recognizing and actively learning from the perspectives of those affected by the phenomenon that we seek to address. And today, and on an everyday, not just on International Women's Day, but certainly on every day, recognizing the importance of putting women and girls not only in the headlines, but at the heart, and their perspectives, putting their perspectives at the heart of what it is that we do. So with that, it's my real pleasure to pass things over to Rachel Pulfer, a very good friend for more years than either of us care to admit, but a colleague who I respect very much with her leadership as Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights. Rachel brings her own background, not only in her own journalistic career, her own writing, but her experience in trying to bridge the practice of journalism and an understanding of the social contribution that journalism can make through her work, for example, as a Massey Fellow and otherwise, in recognizing that journalism is not only the production of a product, but it's a generation of dialogue and of ideas. So we're very privileged to host this event today. I welcome you all here, and please join me in welcoming Rachel to the podium.
Thank you, James. That was very kind. And it's wonderful to see all of you. Happy International Women's Day, especially the students who I know have worked incredibly hard on this event, so thank you very much. There are a number of representatives from different organizations here, including Global Affairs Canada and CARE and Oxfam, as well as the Status of Women. So we're delighted to be hosting you all, and the Refugee Board. It is my great honor to introduce First Journalists for Human Rights. Journalists for Human Rights is an international media development NGO. It is based in Toronto. We have offices in South Sudan, in Istanbul, working with Syrian journalists, working in Amman, in Jordan, and also in Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The organization has been going since 2002. Premise is that by putting human rights in headlines, we can catalyze positive, inclusive public dialogue, governance, and social change. And that indeed is what we've been seeing. For the past 10 years, we've put a big focus on prioritizing women and girls' voices and concerns in our media development programming in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and now onwards to our current programs. And so the gender impact report that you see on your chairs is the culmination of our impact from the last year, 2018. We look at a few examples of impact from Syria, from South Sudan, from Jordan, and from the DRC. And I think you'll see in these examples it shows the catalytic impact that putting women and girls issues into headlines and at the heart of coverage can have on public dialogue and social outcomes related to women and girls' rights. So great honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's also my privilege to introduce this esteemed panel, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about each panelist. We have an incredible group of people here, and so first off, I'm delighted to introduce Nimo Bokore. Dr. Bokore is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Carleton University, and for over a decade, her research has focused on immigrant and refugee resettlement in Canada. As a resettled refugee herself, she brings a rich perspective and a profound approach to her work, and her latest study explores how Canadian Somali women conceptualize war trauma, forced migration, and how these circumstances influence their later resettlement process. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bokore. We also have, very fortunate to have with us Esther Karen Ngoro. I've known Esther for a couple of years now. She's worked in Tanzania as a journalist for the past 14 years, and she has done extensive work with regard to women's empowerment and human rights, telling stories of children in remand homes, the killing of elder women for economic gain in northern Tanzania, among many other stories. She also has the distinction, which I see she has left off her very modest bio, of being the female news editor of the Citizen newspaper in Tanzania, which puts you in a really, really fantastic role to share these kinds of stories and what goes into creating and getting out these kinds of stories in a place like Dar es Salaam. Esther is also an editor, a poet, singer, and writer of fiction in both English and Swahili, and she was the recipient of the prestigious William Southern Fellowship, the Gordon and Fisher JHR Fellow. We partnered with Massey College in 2017 at the University of Toronto, and she is currently pursuing a Master of Journalism degree at Carleton. Please welcome Esther. Delighted to also have with us Michael Petru, a three-time National Magazine Award-winning journalist and a long-time foreign correspondent who has reported on conflict and social upheaval across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. Also a fellow in residence currently at Carleton University's Bachelor of Global and International Studies program, and an adjunct professor of history in the Department of History. Michael Petru was the 2018 Martin Wise Goodman Canadian Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and in 2017 he won the R. James Travers Foreign Corresponding Fellowship, which he used to report on Syrian refugees in the Middle East. He's also a fellow at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Welcome, Michael. And finally, we have, last but not least, Zain Al-Maghrabi. Zain is the Senior Programs Manager at Journalists for Human Rights. If it's got conflict, Zain manages it. So Zain runs our DR Congo program, our Mali program, our Syria program, and our South Sudan program. And as you will hear in some of the examples of impact that he will share, his work and the results have been absolutely spectacular. So we're very honored to have Zain here with us today. Okay, so let's kick things off. I'm going to go down the line, and each person is going to speak for a few minutes about how their work relates to the topic that we're discussing, women and girls' rights and headlines in refugee situations and conflict situations. So, Dr. Bokore, you could start.
Oh, I'm usually loud, so this topic relates to my work that I have been doing since I arrived in Canada as a refugee, resettled refugee through government programs. And in my research through over the years, I have been looking into women and girls issues, especially when it comes to trauma and how their voices are silenced. And that led me to actually LERRN, and how LERRN is looking at into women's voices, especially into regional perspective. So that's it. Hello, everyone. Hello. From where I come from, when people say hello, the others say hello too. So, okay. As she said, my name is Esther, and actually, I'm so happy to be here. I was just thinking as I was sitting here, when did I say yes to doing this? I'm so used to sharing my thoughts in a written form and not be in a panel and, talking like this. But I said yes because I believe that this is an important discussion. It's important to talk about women and girls. Tanzania is not a war, it's not a conflict zone per se, but we do have challenges and we do have problems as a developing country. And over the years in my career, I feel fortunate, or I feel blessed to be part of changing the narrative of how women are, the stories around women and girls. I wanted to share something brief, not exactly about my work, but about how I became a journalist. So a friend of mine once told me that when we were teenagers, I said to her, I don't remember, but apparently I said, there are two things that I'll never be in my life, a teacher and a journalist. But my mother was actually a journalist, and after I finished my high school, she told me, so you shouldn't just stay at home, why don't you just, intern in this newspaper? I know the editor there, it was a lady, and I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I went into the newsroom and I never got out. That's my story. But I think, looking back, what made me remain in the newsroom is because not only that my mother encouraged me, but also I had a very strong editor and a leader in that newsroom who groomed me and enabled me to grow as a young journalist up to this point where I am today. So I believe that as much as both men and women have a part in telling stories about women, there is something significant when women, join hands and do it together. Yeah.
If I stand up, can you hear me okay? Would that be all right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to use a couple minutes to address the question why women's voices are absent in a lot of the coverage about conflict zones and humanitarian disasters. And I'm just going to speak about those barriers for someone like me, for Western journalists. Because I think the resulting coverage has a cascading effect for public policy and for politics. And the reason I think, the main reason, or the reason I want to focus on, it's banal, but I think it's true. A lot of journalists, and I'm guilty of this myself, I've committed this error, and it's had a cascading effect on poor reporting I produce. We're more likely to interview people, to interact with people that we are able to access easily, perhaps that we like, that are safe to interview, that inhabit spaces that we can get into. So what that means, to give a couple non-gender examples, I've reported from Iran, and of course my first time there, I talked to young people from North Tehran, and then my coverage would not reflect the support that, say, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad would get in the election a year later. Reporting from Russia, you go to Moscow, you go to St. Petersburg, you're inclined or you're lazy and you speak to people that are eager to speak to you as a Western journalist, maybe through student networks, and you miss everything that's happening outside the capitals. And I think when it comes to gender, it's similar. And the caveat, of course, is that good journalists break through this barrier and make a special effort to talk to people that don't want to talk to them, that are difficult to get to. My role in journalism, generally when I work abroad, is if I see another foreign correspondent in the wrong place. But what that means, and again, this is a simple, banal point, but as a man, as a Western man, there are spaces that are more difficult for me to access, so I'm less likely to interview those people. A lot of, especially in some conflict zones in the Middle East, there are simply spaces that I have less access to, or I have different access to than my women Western counterparts, and especially local journalists themselves, which is why I absolutely applaud some of the aspirations that LERRN has, and what Rachel's talked about in terms of creating a dialogue with the Global South and having journalism reflect that dialogue rather than simply going, reporting, and coming back. The caveats I have to that problem, or getting past that problem, first is, like I said, any good journalist needs to get outside of their comfort zone, needs to make a special effort to do things that are difficult, that don't come easy, to seek out the voices that are quiet. And that is the number one job as a correspondent. The other thing I'd say is the obvious kind of solution to the problem that I laid out is, well, we just need more women journalists. Yes, absolutely, that's true. We need more women journalists. We need more women correspondents. We especially need more women and men from the Global South to hear their stories directly. The caveat I just say is this. I've been on a panel like this last year, and there was a very famous woman journalist on the panel who was describing how she feels obligated to get the stories of women in conflict zones, and it was very effective, and she's widely admired journalist. And then, because the sort of network of people that report around the world is small, I happened to be chatting with her fixer a little while later. A fixer is a term that journalists use for a local hire. They're usually local journalists. They're invaluable in terms of keeping you safe, in terms of making connections. And so I started chatting with this fixer who had worked with this journalist in Afghanistan. And he was describing exploitative and dishonest behavior in terms of lying to women, and I'm just taking this photograph for me, and then the photographs end up published around the world later on. So all I'm saying is that it's not having more women journalists doesn't solve everything. I mean, my female colleagues can be just as parasitic and predatory as my male ones, because we're human. So that, again, that's another banal point, but I guess just to underline that I feel like I dug myself a hole.
And I present you the self-hating journalist.
Exactly.
I know it because I am one.
There we go. Yeah. So,
actually, that's
Well,
yes.
I value and celebrate my colleagues. I'm just saying that just as bad as I am. That's
okay, we'll have a chance to pile on to Michael in a minute. I just want to give Zane his opportunity to say a couple of words before we pile on.
Okay, in my work, wherever
whenever there's a conflict, the first thing that happens is bad people have access to guns, and they have access to power, so they can hurt people more severely. And the first they always choose are women and girls, and it's a fact, it's an unfortunate fact that always happens. So for us, in these circumstances, when we are talking about the conflict itself, because even when people leave the conflict and go somewhere else that could be deemed as safe, the practices of oppression continue to exist. So we are stuck in the same cycle, just different kind of oppression or different kind of harming that happens. So what we do is that we work with media, we work with civil society, and we work with key players, key stakeholders, people who are capable of making some change. We work with them to improve the living conditions. We work with them to increase and enhance accountability towards everyone who has something to do with the issue, whether it's the person with the big guns, whether it's someone who can help and not helping. All of these elements that are participating in the cycle of gender inequality, we go after them through media and civil society in particular in order to achieve sustainable solutions that will lead somewhere, whether it's on the short run, long run, it doesn't matter, as long as we can get the sustainable solution and then we follow up on it to replicate what should be replicated, and in some cases even you can duplicate a couple of things here and there. But that's maybe to summarize it.
And we'll get into some examples shortly, but I got the sense that you had something to say, so let's move on.
Yeah. It's actually I wear two hats. I was a journalist before I became a social worker. I was a journalist from Ethiopia. And I reported on the war between Somalia and Ethiopia in the 1977. Oh, I don't want to tell my age, but I was reporting at that time.
You were 4 years old.
Well, it was before I was born. I was reporting. So, imagining journalists' reports are conditioned responses. I was working for a state-run media. Reporting from the war zones between Ethiopia, like in the eastern Ethiopian sides, and presenting like exactly what happened, not what happened, but what the government wants you to see. One of the stories that happened was I was in Jigjiga, it's a city in eastern Ethiopia, now Kilil 5, and in Gode, that another, those of you who have been in that side, and Redawa, and the government was selecting men from different cities, and they were killing them as terrorists. And 5 of those men was very close relatives, my cousins, but sorry. And when I was reporting live, I was reporting as a terrorist. I know they were not terrorists. So the conflict that you have to go through, either whether you have access to it or not, is that piece. The other thing is when I was sitting as a refugee in refugee camps with 4 children in Djibouti, in Somalia, what the journalists were interested were how much aid came in and how the aid is reaching them and all that stuff. But they were not actually reporting what was happening into those refugee camps at night. When women and children we were dealing with the horrible impacts that any other human can do to humans. They see the impacts of it. They see what is happening to the children, but that was not actually what they were interested. What was interested is what is UNHCR providing to those. What are those border guards are doing? And nobody was reporting when you are crossing the borders or when you are looking for any kind of food. What those NGOs themselves were doing or what the security people are doing. The journalists who were there were not reporting to that. So, coming back with those, sorry I get emotional because I have to tell you my nightmares. That is what drove me to do social work and mental health and focusing on the trauma perspective of what is happening to this woman and bringing out, from feminist perspective, bringing out the voices of the woman. Because they are the first witnesses of what the atrocities of war. So if we are really documenting war, if we are really looking for changing any transformative change, whether it comes to policy, whether it comes to education, whether it comes to intervention or programs, we really have to talk to the people that it happened to them. And that is what my interest is in LERRN, not what we are doing in Kenya and Dadaab refugee camps, or the conversation that we had with South Pacific refugee women from University of Australia, I'm excited about, or the Jordan Aman, the woman that you connect. That is what I am interested in. And as journalists right now, especially the media the age that we are in, it's the impact, it's the quick report. What is the political impact of this? It's not actually what is really can be printed. It's not up you, but it's, I don't know. Since I was practicing 30 years ago, the journalism changed. Some of you before you were born. So it changed. So what you are looking at right now may be different. It's not about gender. Yes, gender comes into point. When you are a refugee, you are completely exhausted telling your stories over and over and over and over again. And for those of you who understand trauma process, you don't want to live and revisit. At the same time, what happens to your brain is your story changes. You don't, the way you remember changes. So matching those stories, the horrific questions that the journalist wants you to answer, it's sometimes very difficult. So people, women don't volunteer to share their stories. That's another one challenge. The other challenge is the cultural perspective of it. It's very hard to talk to what happened to women who are going to be stigmatized. I write about these issues, how women are stigmatized and outcasted if they tell their stories. There is a religion piece of it. So not only trauma, so it is very difficult. Yes, there are multi-challenges for getting the story of women and presenting the story of women, but it's also our commitment to really reach them and crossing the gender gap, learning about the trauma and the impact that they have in addition to the journalism piece, and bringing their voices so we can make a change.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Bokode, for such a powerful story that you shared with us. That is so important. Thank you. I'm going to invite Zain to speak for a minute about a story that we worked on in a refugee camp on the border with Jordan and Iraq, which I think helps to illustrate the importance of this ground game of ensuring that journalism can really get at what's happening to women and girls and with women and girls in these environments and create positive change. So Zain, if you could share the story of Al-Rukban.
Okay, so I'm going to be brief about it because it's a bit too much details. The issue is there is a camp, Syrian internally displaced people or refugees. The camp is between Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. And each government was blaming it on the other ones. So they would say, the Jordanians and the Iraqis would say, it's not on our soil, it's not our responsibility, it's on the borders. And the Syrians would say, we cannot reach them, it's on your borders, it's your responsibility. So you can imagine the situation that they were stuck in. It's in the desert, there's no aid going in. About 75,000 people to 60,000 in that kind of range were living off 2 taps of water. That's it, that's about it. Children were dying because there's no access to formula. The most ridiculous reasons of any conflict were affecting people to immediately die because the Jordanian government won't let them in to take the health care, and the Iraqis not involved, and the Assad doing his job in sieging these territories. What we did is, after a while from last June till October, the camp was completely sieged. Nothing was coming in, nothing was going out. It reached a disastrous situation. So what we did is we worked with a network of our journalists, Syrian human rights journalists, throughout 5 Syrian media outlets, not international, not BBC, no, Syrian media outlets. We prepared a material. We worked with them on training, mentoring the process. They prepared the material about this camp. every issue, not just one issue, not just picking, it's difficult, so disaster, no. The whole thing, the whole situation was covered. All the people who can help were contacted, whether through the journalists who are in Turkey or the reporters inside of Syria or even the reporters inside the camp itself. And we discovered a lot of problems in the whole system that is going on, but that's not the issue. The issue is that they communicated with the UN agencies that are in Damascus and are functional, and Assad regime actually needs them to be functional in certain territories. We communicated with them, or our journalists and reporters communicated with them throughout the period of 2 to 3 days. Constant calls, constant communications. About 30 to 35 reporters and journalists were just calling the same people about the issue as answer us right now. Why a little bit of milk is not going in. Sometimes it's very, like, it's the cheapest kind of pills can save a life. Why they're not going in? So they were blaming Assad, etc. So on the third day, which was in October, all of the media content that was being worked on was published. And we had a coverage on a radio station going on between 6 to 7 hours, constantly on the same subject. So what we had is that the local media was covering the same thing, all of it about the Rukban camp. The next day, after the Assad regime was contacted by the UN agencies who are in Damascus, and after the kind of issue that came to light as being horrible, he allowed a UN convoy, a humanitarian aid, to go into the camp. And the convoy actually reached the camp after a couple of days. Now that did not stop, because the tragedy in the camp still exists, right? We kept on working on it, and we made sure, because the people who are responsible for the humanitarian aid inside the camp were contacting our media people and telling them, Assad might say he will let it in this time, might not do it next time, or it's not going to happen, etc. So we kept on the pressure, and we've managed to get it in once, twice, and 3 times. Now that could not appear to be, okay, we solved the problem of the camp, but there's thousands of people right now out alive because of the work that has been done by those journalists and reporters. And now, right now, we are continuing, and this is what I'm saying about sustainable solutions, because we need the wheel to keep on going, because those people should not live in a camp in the first place. They should go back to where they used to live, or go to a safe and a better place, not to be stuck in the middle of the desert. And right now we are continuing our pressure. There is a promise from here, promise from there about the people will be they will resettled, etc., but we will not stop. But on the bright side of things, we've managed to make Assad, which is not a very lovely person, and his regime is not so, not very good. We've managed to get him at least to acknowledge there's a problem, and it's okay to let these convoys go into the camp. Now, how did that reflect? Because we have the stories, right? And the stories that we have made were not, okay, let's just count the number of taps of water and let's count the number of pills. But it was about the kind of tragedy on a daily basis. And unfortunately, we go back to the same point, which is everyone is suffering, everyone is going through it. However, mainly the women and girls are paying the biggest price for many reasons, and unfortunately, within the camp itself, within the camp, the people who are living there, they were people who are trying to make it appear as everyone is suffering. Oh, no, focus on this and that. We don't want you to focus on this issue. No, the women are doing so great. Come on, you're always going to talk about the women. It was like, okay, they're 50% of the population at least. They deserve at least 50% of the representation and the kind of voices in these stories. At least the 50%. It's their fair share. And if we go on the issues, they deserve it. And we've managed to do it. And it happened. And we've got their stories. And some of the issues are addressed or being addressed. However, that's always an issue, because on another subject in northern Syria, we were working on addressing the issue of the honor killings. The honor killings are a thing in the Middle East, generally speaking, and Northern Africa, is that if a woman does anything that has to do with anything that could be considered sexual, it's okay to kill her. Regardless of the thing, of the level of the thing, anything of that nature, whether you're the brother, you're the father, you're the husband, you're a very, very distant cousin, just have the same last name, you have the right to do so. And it has been an issue that people were trying to address for a couple of decades right now, till now in the Middle East, and it reached nowhere. So what we did is, in the past weeks, we worked with the media, with the journalists who are capable of doing their job right now. We work with them, and we work with lawyers who are, in some cases, not the most feminist. They're not. But they actually see that this is an issue, this is a problem, regardless of what you think politically, socially, whatever, this is a problem, because they're lawyers and they're good people, so we work with those people. And we work with civil society organizations who are women's rights organizations, and they're actually doing their job. Not the ones who are just there just to appear on TV, etc., the ones who are active. We got our information in the sense of how we can create more pressure, but pressure on whom? In this case, it was society. It's just like the same situation in the camp who are trying to minimize the suffering of women and girls. It was society who was fighting back, because lawyers will say, yeah, it's a problem. Religious people, people of religion, are saying, yeah, it's a problem. So where's the issue then? The issue we found out, one, when it's a dictatorship, the dictator stops any kind of conversation about it because he doesn't want any trouble for the sake of women and girls. And on the second one, is society is not aware of the issue. We did our work, we did our production, we did our even forums internally, and we did everything that could be done in order just to make it clarified, but we did in an inclusive approach that included everyone who has something to do with the issue. And the thing that we've got at the end of it, which was yesterday actually, the Islamic Council that I don't know if anyone speaks Arabic, but it's like ulama Muslimin. Those are the people who issue fatwa. Fatwa in Islam is the religious order to Muslims to tell them, this is okay, this is not okay, and this is how you do it, and this is why not to do this. So it's religious kind of based kind of orders. And the fatwa was issued yesterday, stating that honor killings, if you're gonna kill someone who is related to you, because someone told you she's in love with a guy or doing something with a guy, if you do that, it's a major sin, you're going to hell forever. It's not in Islam, don't do that. And they went through the whole kind of basis of things. But we got it, and we got that because we made it clear as much as possible. And we made it clear to them that the people should know your opinion. And they were afraid, even the religious people, who would tell you, yeah, it's wrong and it's against Islam. We're afraid of the people's reaction against them, that they might call them infidels and traitors and working for the benefit of the imperialists and the West. But after the war, we've got it yesterday. There is no backlash, because it was made very clear that it is your religion. If you don't want to accept your religion, you don't want to accept the rule of law, you're accepting something weird. It's something completely different. It's your call how you're going to go with it, but this is the order of things. And in the coming Fridays, if not this one, the one after, 100 mosques in northern Syria are going to do, on Friday there's the prayer, it's instead of Sunday. They're gonna make it clear to Muslims that the honor killings is against Islam. For the first time it's gonna happen in the Middle East. Oh, definitely for the first time it's gonna happen in Syria. And most important, not about this and that actually. Most importantly, it's gonna be done by the people of the area, by the people of this territory and that territory, from the communities, not through paid money from the outside or something orchestrated. It's coming from within, from the grassroots. And we're going to get that done. So, sorry for talking too much.
Thank you, Zain. Pretty incredible. So a fatwa against honor killing, guys. That's what local media can do in northern Syria. Yeah. I'd like to switch tacks a little bit and ask Esther if you could share a couple of stories about best practices of covering stories that pertain to women and girls' rights, and the challenges. I mean, you were a news editor, so you were in a position of significant authority in your newsroom, but what were some of the challenges of getting some of these stories out?
Thank you. I think first we need to ask ourselves, do we need to tell stories about women and girls? And why? Why do we need to tell those stories? I know it might sound like a rhetorical question, but these are the kind of questions you face every day as a journalist in the newsroom. And to be honest, the newsroom is a very sexist environment. I'm sure most working places perhaps are, but working in the newsroom, you see the kind of thought, the kind of perception that is perpetuated, not just about the women or the stories that we cover, but just about women in general. I remember as a cub reporter when I started working as a journalist, I was very surprised to see how male editors would flirt with young reporters or things like that. So it's just generally an environment where you feel uncomfortable to work as a female journalist. And so, yeah, I think first the question of why are we telling these stories? Do we need to tell these stories? And is it just a story about the other, about those women, you know, things out there that perhaps seem insignificant because in Tanzania, as in many societies, it's a society that does not value the voices of women. Going back to what Michael was saying, that perhaps we don't need more women journalists, I actually would agree with him, but not because both men and women are bad. I would actually argue that we already have enough journalists, women journalists, at least in Tanzania. But the problem is, the more you go higher in the hierarchy of power in the newsroom, you have less women editors, you have less women in managerial positions. So even though you have a pool of reporters, who is it that at the end of the day decides what's the story and what isn't? Of course it's the man. And even working as an editor, being in an editorial meeting, many times as the only woman in the room, you can feel the energy when it comes to talking or discussing about a specific story that is specifically about women. There's this expectation that you will have to fight for that story, you know, for it to be published. I remember a few years ago, the government had passed a VAT tax exemption on sanitary pads. And we went back and forth discussing why that was a story worth covering. To the point that one editor in the room said, come on, there are much important things to talk about. We have corporate tax. Really don't need to spend another minute talking about why we should write about this. And these are the kinds of things that make you feel angry because, you know, in the 21st century, there's no way you would imagine that anyone would think stories that regard to women are not stories worth covering. But then again, I wonder if, I don't think it's just about stories related to women. I think there's a lack, at least in the newsroom, the gender sensitivity to issues. Because it's not just about, say, FGM or child bride-ish stories or something that is quite directly related to the female gender. But do we see the lack of water or electricity as a gender-sensitive issue? What are the perception that we have related to the issues, the everyday issues, and how they relate to women? So I think that instead of continuing to preach about women empowerment, I think what's lacking is a change of mindset in the men, you know? Because when we say that we need to empower the woman, we're basically saying that she's weak, she's unable, and she's in a position of lack. But I would argue that I do not need to be empowered. I am already powerful and capable and able. But it's because someone feels that they need to give me that power. That language is very appealing. And for me, I really cringe. I mean, I understand that there are communities that you need to change infrastructure. You need to create more resources for women to access and be able to empower themselves, I guess. But still, at the end of the day, there is that perception that it's the man empowering the woman and not that she is already capable herself. So, in a nutshell, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a need to change the perception in the newsroom, perhaps also in other corridors of power among NGOs around how we look at issues and women empowerment. Yeah.
Thank you, Esther. I'm going to hand the mic back to Michael, and I'm wondering if you can respond to reflect on some of what you've heard and share, perhaps, in your view, what are some of the consequences of not including women and girls' voices in coverage?
I'll do my best. Thank you. I should clarify. I absolutely think we need to have more women in journalism. Mostly because it results in better, more fully rounded production of journalism. Because being a woman can, not all the time, but can facilitate access to spaces that are more difficult for male reporters to access. And many of those spaces involve women that are, women and girls that are suffering the results of conflict and displacement, who, as Zane and Dr. Bakari both said, make up a disproportionate amount of the victims of conflict. You know, on the one level, conflict zones can be very, especially, and it's changing. I mean, thank goodness it's changing. But conflict zones can be a very male space. You know, you often have a disproportionate number of male reporters. You have who are interacting with perhaps fighters and soldiers. There's a certain, and this is changing, thank goodness it's changing, but there's a certain, it's changing radically actually, even just in the less than 20 years that I've worked in as a foreign correspondent. But there can be a certain, this is a very clumsy way of putting it, but a certain kind of it's a terrible way of putting it. This is a very male culture, I guess, which could happen in conflict zones, involving everything from just the way we talk, and I mean, that's a problem. And yet, given that there's this sort of superficial surface maleness to a lot of conflict zones, it is, again, to repeat the points of my colleagues, it is women and girls that suffer a disproportionate amount. So, yes, we absolutely should have more female reporters, and we should have more voices, people generating those reports from the communities that they're in. My only point that I was clumsily trying to make is that having more women reporters, or the fact that a reporter is a woman, and this is an obvious point, doesn't mean she's necessarily going to be any more ethical than a male reporter. And perhaps I'd even argue, if one were to argue that the opposite was the case, that's patronizing in itself. In terms of my own coverage, look, as I said in the beginning, I haven't lived up to Zane's standard of having 50% of the voices in my reportage being women and girls. Absolutely not. I think that's a noble goal. I think it's an important goal. Again, because it's women and girls that disproportionately suffer the effects of conflict. But I've never done this, but I have absolutely no doubt. If I were to go back and do a simple data analysis of people quoted in hundreds of stories over almost 20 years in conflict and disaster zones, I have no doubt there would be a massive gender imbalance. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the barriers, but more so the barriers in my own work habits that I cited in my opening statement. So I try. I recognize that there are times when I hold back, and again, I think women should hold back as well. I mean, and Dr. McCoy talked about some of the horrible things that happen to women in conflict zones and refugee camps. And I was in Iraq in 2014, and of course, look, the sex slavery of the so-called Islamic State, yes, it's an important story, absolutely. And yes, those Yazidi women deserve to be heard, but God, it got uncomfortable to see and to read and to be a part of what felt predatory, of showing up in a refugee camp and saying, "Tell me how you got raped." I mean, it's just. So I'm not sure how to. I'm not sure. I mean, how to deal with that. I think the way or how to work with that. I think the approach is to be very, very slow and very, very respectful. But anyway, so the short answer is I haven't met the standard Zane says, but I'm closer now in my more recent reportage than I was 15 years ago. So.
Wonderful. That brings us to the question of best practices for covering women and girls issues in these kinds of very, very difficult situations. And I'm going to put it back to Dr. Bokore to share your thoughts on that.
In my current life as an educator and as a researcher, the best practice in working with refugees, women and girls, I actually published this year at SAGE how to do life stories. You can access and read it. So coming back to the education piece of it, for me it's teaching students who are going to be future psychotherapists or future NGOs the importance of hearing their stories and working with them through their stories. Because of the trauma, stories are changing. As a practitioner, somebody who is doing the assessment, the story she told you yesterday may be different to the story that she told you today. That doesn't mean she's lying to you. It's just how she remembered it today, what she has access to it. And doing changes, creating changes through those stories is neurobiologically changing that stories. My aim is actually not only healing these women or not healing these communities through their stories, but changing intergenerationally future generations who are going to be impacted by what happened today. So through education, that's what I am doing. And the research, the challenge I am have is, Zane, thank you for what you did in terms of changing about the fatwa and issue. As a researcher doing and researching Islamic communities, the challenge that I face is, okay, I have the stories that they interested in me, but how do I represent those? What is the impact of that story? When I'm using it, why my intention is to heal the communities or to heal that person. But how is the other side? Because I'm also part of the community. I am part 50% Ethiopian and 50% Somali. So I'm still attached to the Somali, what's happening in Somalia. So it is a challenge. In writing, like you cannot name people. Like there was a time in Somalia, like in 2006, women were not allowed to wear bras because it is bra, they sell it as haram. So just imagine, how do you do any kind of work going outside? So it's completely paralyzed and staying home. The other thing is women are not, like if she gets pregnant, she will be stoned. Nobody is asking her what happened, but she is just penalized because she is pregnant. So when she tells you as a researcher those stories, how do you present what happened and how do you make changes when you are after changes in program development? So in program development, what is the needs? How do I present those needs? What do women at that time need? So those are the challenges that we are dealing with as researchers, which is still kind of what you are dealing with. Being here in the West and doing research in the West, whether you are a journalist or a researcher, bringing something out and that will be seen in other places. So, but the other thing is we have to work on these things. The stories are as a liberation. It's women's rights, human rights. It's a documentation of the history of what happened and stopping that. It's also creating programs for future generation to stop that pain, internal pain. I raised 4 children. When I left Ethiopia, I had 3 children under 10 and a baby that was a month old. And I was sitting in a refugee camp outside because they didn't allow us to go into Djibouti to the city, so outside. And Djibouti is 50 in the June. It's 50 degrees. It's too hot, and the ration water that you are getting is limited for that. So the trauma raising those kids who went through that, who remember those things, the documentation of that is really important. At the same time, teaching the people who will be working, whether they are working in NGOs, whether they are working maybe global affairs in borders somewhere, social workers, yes, they go to those places, hearing those stories, the changing stories, accepting the changing stories, and making a better resettlement program, a better healing process if it is resettlement right here in the city, or maybe allowing them as a liberation to tell maybe to a journalist what happened to them, or to write it about what happened to them, and sharing their stories with other women, so they will not be alone. So that is where I come from for a change.
As a journalist, of course, I'm a storyteller, so obviously I think the best practice here is to keep on telling the stories about women and girls and issues around women and girls. But I also think there's a need for continuity. So I recall how when I was a reporter, for many years then I have been an editor, there are a number of stories that didn't go anywhere. I would do a story. I remember I did a series about children who are in conflict with the law, children who are in remand homes all over the country. And the push, it did not get the push that I thought it would. And I knew why that was, because it's about children, It's not about the economy or something serious, something important. So I felt like in the newsroom, there is the need to prioritize issues around women and children and girls. And that need for continuity of a story, to keep telling the story again and again until we see change. I think that's how I would like to answer that question. And of course, one more thing I forgot, is that I think, again, I'm going back to your thought, Michael, I'm sorry. As much as perhaps having more women would not change the story per se, but I feel like we need more spaces for women to tell the story the way they want to tell it. And this is eventually what I want to do, and where I am in my career, to have my own platform, to create a platform where women can tell the stories that they want and the way they want to tell them. And I think that if we create more and more spaces where we are free to do that, we'll slowly change the culture.
Fantastic. Final question, and then we'll open it to the floor. What, in your view, panelists, do you feel Canada's role could be in helping to tell the stories of women and girls in refugee situations and conflict zones? What can Canada do meaningfully and usefully?
I think we need to create a form. Canada can do by respecting the stories of people, like by training those people who will be hearing those stories, whether it is a border, whether it's asylum seeking, whether it's journalists who are reporting into those stories. We can change how we value women's stories, or how we fund. We can improve how we fund women's organizations who are helping women who are already here or maybe in the refugee camps to heal, because women every human being was come out of a woman's stomach. So somehow women are important into the future generation. So women's programs are important, and we have the capability to fund. We have the capability to fund research that is talking about women's issues, women and children's issues, including girls. And what I see is, I think those pieces, if we can do those, if we can change how we hear the stories, because right now in the border, there is a person who is sitting in the border who is taking the stories. I think the story, that thing didn't change. When you are seeking an asylum or when you are applying for resettlement, there is one person who is interviewing you. And that person's perspective is what makes a change in your life. How that person hears your story. They have the ability to say yes or no. The reason I end up in Europe, and I'm a storyteller to do life history things, is I was sitting in Mogadishu. Since I'm 50% Somali and 50% Ethiopian, I am allowed to work in Somalia. So I was registered for resettlement programs through UNHCR in Mogadishu. The person who was in charge, he was from Ghana, another African at that time, and he heard somehow through the grapevine that I got a job. So when my resettlement came in, he canceled my resettlement because I had a job. What he didn't put into my story is I am 50% Ethiopian. If anything, in that time, Ziad was falling and things were happening. And my children are, yes, like me, they are 50% Somali and 50% Ethiopian. But the worst thing that was happening at that time, my children were, that 50% was coming from Somaliland, where Ziad was attacking. So in the city of Mogadishu that we were in at that time, Ziad's soldiers were kidnapping and raping children, even 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds at night. It was just horrible things were happening. That's 1986, when he was about to fall down. I ran to the office and I said, this is what is happening to me. Could you please reinstate me for resettlement? I am dying here. And my children are going to be dying. He didn't hear my story. He didn't hear a single of it. He said, oh, you are resettled, you have a job. That forced me to buy a passport and to seek visa and to run all the way to Europe. So, yes, I had the ability. I was speaking English the way I'm speaking. It's not good, but I'm speaking the way I'm speaking to you right now. And I was a trained journalist, and I had that information to find out, to go to Europe and to save my children to Europe, because I couldn't buy it. Mengistu was still there in Ethiopia. As a journalist, I was in prison because of the report that I did for 7 months. I was tortured right now. What you see me limping, and my optical nerve was damaged. Like I can't see a lot of things. I can't go back to Ethiopia. I can't stay in Somalia. I don't have any place else. But that person didn't hear my story to save me. So what Canada can do is training these people to save their lives, not only save lives, but actually changing people's lives. And that's, I think, a human right and our responsibility to do something good for women and girls.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bokole. You've lived hundreds of lives.
Well, they also talk about yes, I survived because the trauma process, like the people who were like me, who are still affected. The women who were, I interviewed women from Djibouti because I was looking how Somalis are impacted. And Somalis are divided into 5 through colonization. So I interviewed women from Djibouti, I interviewed women from Somaliland and southern Somalia from Italian, under the Italian protectorate a long time ago, and Somalis from Kenya. And I was looking what happened to them. And I saw a lot of women who survived like me, but I also saw a lot of women who didn't survive, and their children didn't survive. That 12% of Somalis, who are only 37,000 up to 40,000 in Canada, 12% of youth are now in jail. We have 25% to 27% of dropouts, it's called dropouts, and they are coming from those families who are impacted by. So either they are suffering PTSD, or like me, they have post-traumatic growth and resilience, and they survive it. So we need to tell those stories. Those women, when I was interviewing, who were isolated, they thought they were alone. And those women who survived, they thought because they just survived and everybody else did.
So journalists in Canada tell those stories. Those are important stories.
My thoughts are not very far from Nemo's in terms of the role that Canada can play in, say, a country like Tanzania. There are organizations such as Tanzania Media Fund that assist journalists by providing grants to tell stories that matter. And I think that Canada is in a position to support that kind of initiative so that the stories around women and girls continue to be told. So that's one way that Canada can play a role. But again, as I said, I see a need here for a change of mindset. Of course, this takes time. But I feel that there needs to be more programs in the newsroom that challenge backward thinking, really. Of course, and in many newsrooms around the world, including Canada, but since we're talking about Tanzania, yeah, so I think that's how I'd like to answer that question. I think Canada can play a role in those two ways.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you. I'm going to answer this in a narrow fashion and just looking by what Canada can do, specifically the government of Canada, and in terms of telling the stories, I'm going to refer specifically just to journalism and getting those stories out through the media. I'll give you the very short answer, and then I'll walk it back a little bit and give some more nuance. The short answer is nothing. Stay out of my sandbox. I am deeply uncomfortable with government validating any sort of media or having a role in what stories get told, what is legitimate journalism production. That's kind of my heart reaction. That said, I understand that the situation is very different in non-democracies, and I do think that Canada has a role to play. The government of Canada has a role to play, including through funding, to amplify those voices, perhaps in ways that Esther talked about. But it has to be, and I can't emphasize this enough, it has to be arm's length. So in terms of getting those voices out there, yes, that can be done through ways, legal protection for countries where journalists are harassed and persecuted, funding civil society groups that provide that sort of legal protection, internship and training programs, similar to what JHR does already. Civil society. This is a ground game. It's a long-term project. Building civil society, democratization, education. It's a long-term process. Getting women into schools, getting women into scholarship programs in journalism schools. I fully, absolutely support those sort of measures, and those are the sort of measures that it's building a foundation that will pay dividends later on. What I'm uncomfortable with, and as I kind of provocatively said at the beginning, is anything that erodes that editorial wall between a government organization and media. Media thrives. Media can only be legitimate, it can only do its job when it has editorial independence, and even well-intentioned infringement on that independence through funding and even awards makes me a little bit uneasy. So absolutely, I think Canada has a role in amplifying those voices, but I would like to see that happen more through the growth of civil society, legal protection, internships, trainings, the sort of foundation on which journalism decisions are made later on.
And Zane is a new Canadian.
All right. In my opinion, it should be focused on sustainable, ensuring there is sustainable flow of information from these kind of territories and regions and to them, and make sure that these information are presented in a way that is comprehensible to the general public and pointed out this is what it means and that what means, so everyone understands what's happening and understand that in a certain refugee camp, for example, in North and South Sudan, and there we are supported by the Canadian government, by Global Affairs Canada to do our job. We are doing some sort of intervention, which is to make media, local media, South Sudanese media, have the capacity on one hand and also be able to do, which is to take the information from these camps and let everyone who is running them, managing them, supporting them, involved in one way or another, know how the actual situation is. But the most important piece in it, that because if I'm going to see an organization, I'm going to tell you, thank you, but here's the problem. You are sending too much cooking oil, and they need something to cook with that oil. It's way too much cooking oil in this case. You might tell me, oh, okay, thank you, Zane, bye-bye. And that would be it. But if we take that information to media, you cannot dismiss it. Everyone is going to know that you are not taking care of it. Because you can easily say, we didn't get actual information or appropriate information about how much cooking oil. And I'm bringing the cooking oil example because it's an actual thing that did happen where people were in need of food and they've got a massive bottle of cooking oil with a little bit of fries. Now, I'm a cook. I know how to cook. And I know you don't need that much oil for this much of fries. Still, that was the percentage. So we need to make sure, and this is what Canada can do. It's not non-political, non-armed intervention. Intervention based on building the capacity in order to get the info, bring the info back, and make the info visible. So we can see it, we can understand it, and then it can go places in making things in a better way. That way, transparency and all the ethical lines when it comes to media are kept and saved. On the other hand, also, we have managed to make something out of it and improve things. And we are already doing some of that, like I mentioned, with Global Affairs Canada, and we're getting some results out of it. So.
I speak loudly enough, I think you can hear me. Should I stand? My name is Melanie Glenn, I'm with Oxfam Canada. I worked on the media side of things for Oxfam Canada for quite a few years. And I have two kind of thoughts, and there's a question in there as well. I thought it was very interesting, Esther's comment on empowerment and the problem with using the word empowerment, and empowerment is a word that NGOs use a lot. We continue to do so. However, I have seen some progress in terms of moving away from empowering women towards saying that local women's organizations need to get funding directly so they themselves are the decision makers and the protagonists in refugee camps. So that's something that I know Oxfam and CARE and many other organizations are striving to do more of. I can't say that it's we're not there yet 100%, but I have seen progress over the years that I've worked in the NGO sector. So I think that's good news, but still lots of progress to make. One of the questions that I have, and it's so I've heard a lot from Zane in terms of journalists wanting to tell a certain story and going to NGOs, and perhaps there wasn't that reception there. I'm interested if you've also seen the opposite, because having worked for an NGO, there's often stories that we want to tell and we don't get reception from the media, whether they're female reporters or male reporters. And we're often told, like, that story won't sell, or my editor won't buy it, I don't have enough time to cover that story, we're going into Iraq for 3 days and we're on this tour with the Prime Minister and we only have 1 day to do a side trip and I don't have time to really, So there's always a lot of excuses. So I would really like to hear how you think NGOs, INGOs like Oxfam, could work more with journalists to foster an environment where these voices can be can be lifted up, and to give these spaces for women and girls' voices.
Maybe it's true as well. Nice to pick up.
Okay. Can I
Or-
start
or
with it?
think-
Okay, I can give you a quick actual example we're working on right now. Group of stories we are producing about NGOs. We're not making it about the NGO, we're making it about an issue. Now our priority, because naturally in conflict places, women and girls, right? So we pick the issue and then we see in this territory what kind of NGOs are working. So the journalists actually contact them and communicate with them. I will admit, these stories are the most boring stories ever. They're so boring because they are just facts and data. Because what they do is that they ask you as an NGO, as a local NGO, serving group of people, give me contact information for your beneficiaries. Or tell me where are your activities, because I'm going to interview these beneficiaries to point out to you before I publish my story about how useful your services are and what are the problems with them. I will take your feedback again and I'm going to make my story about this issue. So you will read it. For us, it's interesting, but to the public, it's not. It's really not. So when we are working with the journalists, so when we are picking any kind of media outlet, we are picking any kind of journalist, we have a commitment from the person or the organization that we need a human rights stories, we need this and this and this and that, including these things. So they're not the most appealing stories, but they are one of the most important stories. So this is why they get them and they are published. That's one. Two, on the organization collaboration with these things, I will assume, I can't read people's hearts, but I will assume that NGOs who were communicated with or contacted and they were like, all right, here are our beneficiaries, or here's what we do, where we do activities, etc. Are those are somehow doing their job. They have no problem with our media to go to their beneficiaries. Many don't do that. They're like, no. They will give you weirdest excuses, and you know they're not that factual. So we can tell, I suspect you're hiding something, and you are transparent. That means you're doing something, at least to a certain point, you are doing something useful. And this is how we separate between the two. I hope we can reach a point where those who are not collaborating with media, NGOs that do not collaborate with media, are known to, like for example, to you guys, that when you fund them, that those have something they're hiding. So from my end, when you're talking about the idea, okay, they might tell you it's not the most compelling stories, but on my end, when you work with media, they are going to be published, very good stories. The issue is with the NGOs, and this is what we get from it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I work with Melanie and some of our partners in the Humanitarian Coalition of other NGOs in 2017, when I spent a long time in Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon regarding Syrian refugees. Look, I mean, I recognize your frustration. You know, journalists can be frustrating to work with, NGOs can be frustrating to work with, because sometimes we have shared goals and there's shared stories we want to tell, and sometimes we're at cross purposes. I mean, my experience, I'm not just saying this because you're here, my experiences with you in 2017 were excellent. And again, actually, by and large, with all the NGOs I worked with, look, I mean, I don't think it's a mystery. Often the NGOs will pitch a story, and it's true when journalists say that, you know, my editors aren't going to buy that, they're probably being honest. You know, and I mean, the only advice I can give you is it's probably better to be, and most of you are, have all your facts, you know, at easy access, being able to respond to journalists rather than pushing stories. Journalists, we get very territorial when someone tells us what the story is. You know, it's just our backs get right up. Occasionally, I've been in situations where I get the sense that, you know, I've been in a situation where the NGO, the local NGO manager is, you know, encouraging, you know, locals who are receiving the service to, you know, say this, like, and then the journalists, we feel like we're being used to be a public relations machine, and that gets our backups up as well, because it's not what we're doing. So again, I mean, I don't think there's any magic solution. I do recognize your frustration. The only advice I can have is you know, be as responsive and transparent as you can, and recognize that there are stories that you're going to want to get told that that won't be.
We have time for one more question. If there's a question from the audience. One more question.
important to go to hard-to-reach areas or rural areas to get the real stories for women and girls. What are measures that you've seen that are available to journalists, especially as journalists are increasingly being more independent or working in freelance?
So when we are working, for example, in our job, we work with local journalists mainly, right? Whether it's through training, through mentorship, etc., etc. So in some cases, you would be having like some brainstorming session about issues, stuff to cover, and they will let you know immediately because they are from the environment or from the community or the region, etc. This has a high risk. It's very risky. We cannot deal with it this way. And in some cases, or just explaining to James actually, that some issues seems to be very sensitive, and they will tell you, no, it's doable, don't worry about it. So we can do this and that and that, and it happens, and everything goes smoothly. And some issues seem very normal and non-problematic, and then turn out to be very risky. Just like in Turkey, about the price of bread is the most riskiest thing we've witnessed toward journalists. It wasn't about dictatorship, it wasn't about honor killings, for example, or social norms that has been there for decades or hundreds of years. It was about the price of bread, certain kind of bread specifically. So you would be shocked. So you cannot, for example, when it comes to themes, to tell which themes, but you can tell that the journalists I'm working with on the field will let me know this issue is very risky, it's very dangerous, so I'll have to deal with it through a different kind of approach. And when it comes to the personal safety, because at the end of the day, everything can happen, for us, in our work, we found that the most suitable way to do that is to step away from politics, keep it human rights focused, because then you minimize the impact of the people who are going to be angry. Two, when you are making a story, if I'm making a story about you not doing your job, you're not doing your job, whether you're a dictator, whether you are like my colleague at the office, I'm making a story about your performance, the most important thing that we make sure it's inclusive, that I'm going to put your input in the story, you're going to answer me. And if you collaborate and you're transparent, just like Michael pointed out, if you're being responsive, I'm going to point that out, that here's the disagreement, etc. So in that case, I would say the most important thing, work locally, focus on human rights, and most important, be inclusive. So far, I've been with JHR, I think, more than 3 years now. We had zero problems when it comes to the stories or the journalists that we have been working with because of that.
I mean, I think you're keen into what I think is probably one of the most gaping ethical holes, or not ethical, moral holes in journalism. Look, four journalists I've worked directly with have died in conflict zones. You include their families, it's double that almost. I've been in numerous conflict zones. I've never had war zone training. I've been in conflict zones without kidnap and ransom training. Sorry, without kidnap and ransom insurance. You are exactly right to highlight the problem with freelancing. It's a huge, huge ethical problem. Freelancers are willing to go into conflict zones. They can't afford proper insurance. They can't afford proper training. And then if something happens to them, they don't have the institutional backing to pay their ransom, to get them out. The number of news organizations that, and I work for, like I said, I've never had proper training, and I work for major news organizations. It's a handful of people that invest in providing their journalists with war zone training, with counseling afterwards. Never had that either. Some media organizations are better than that, and do provide that and make it mandatory. But it's very, very few, and given the economic pressures on media outlets, given the shift towards freelancing, you have all kinds of people working in conflict zones without proper protection, without training, and without institutional safety net if they get into trouble, and that worries me. And the second thing, I'll be very brief, is their fixers or local engaged partners have almost no protection. If I were to get killed in a conflict zone, my family would either have the insurance backing or they would be able to sue the person that I was writing for. There's none of that for my fixer, and that's another huge, huge disparity between the often Western journalists and the locally engaged fixers. It's a very big and disturbing problem, I think.
Esther, do you have any final words?
Well, thank you very much. What we have heard on this panel are many of the challenges in terms of the means by which we can bring forward these voices and these perspectives. But I think within that is a real conviction of the need to do it and the opportunity that comes from doing that. And so what I want to do by means of conclusion is really to use the mantra of the Network for Refugee Voices, a member of our advisory group, who goes by the very simple mantra, nothing about us without us, nothing about refugees without refugees. And this is emerging not only as a normative principle, not only sort of a rights-based argument of the legitimacy that comes from the inclusion of the perspectives of those most directly implicated in the stories or in the policies or in the programming, but in a very calculated way that it also leads to better programming, it leads to better policy, it leads to better responses. Before coming here, I was teaching a graduate seminar on international organizations and refugees, and issues of legitimacy and accountability really resonate in the ability of collective responses to shared challenges. This lies at the heart of what LERRN is trying to do, is the recognition that collaboration between our NGO partners, with CARE, with Oxfam, with Journalists for Human Rights, in bringing a research perspective that we're not only able to say that this is a good thing to do, but this is an important thing to do. And that by bringing in those voices, those perspectives that are closest to, that live the realities, that have the most nuanced understanding of the context within which we want to try and mobilize these responses, that it's in that process that we're going to generate the evidence that's going to have the greatest impact. And so it's not a question of the academic partners or the partners from the global north coming and setting the agenda. What has liberated us within this effort is being able to bring in tools and to speak with our local partners to say, how best do these tools make sense? What best use can you make of these tools within these contexts? I would like to thank Zane and Michael and Esther and Nemo. I'd like to thank Rachel. I'd like to thank Journalists for Human Rights in sharing the launch of the report with us. I'd like to thank our colleagues from Oxfam and from CARE for being here. I'd like to thank all of you, and I'd like to say a special thanks to Nadia, to Angel, to Imani, to Lashonda, and to Barbara, who made the practicalities, and of course to Janine as well, who made the practicalities of this event possible. Please stay tuned for future developments around the LEARN initiative, the work of our individual partners, but to leave you with the conviction that through partnership, through collaboration, that we're able to build the evidence, we're able to build a practice that can bring about change. Happy International Women's Day. Thank you.